Welcome to Conversations with Frank Fabozzi. I'm Frank Fabozzi. The CFA Institute Research and Policy Center brings this series to you. My guest today is Kenneth Blay. He's the head of research for global thought leadership at Invesco, where he leads the development of original research through collaborations with investment teams, industry researchers, and institutional clients. He has collaborated extensively with Nobel laureate, the late Nobel laureate Harry Markowitz, on developing various asset allocation models. He has published in leading industry journals. He earned a BBA in finance from the University of Texas at San Antonio, and he's a fellow of the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge for Finance and the Center for Endowment Asset Management. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Frank, for having me, and thank you for the invite. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for joining us. You've had an interesting career journey. I mean, I know all about it, but can you share a little about where you began your journey and how you arrived at your current position at Invesco?
Absolutely, yeah. It was interesting. I mean, I started where I am today is not the path that most people get to get to where I am in doing research. So I actually started in what I'll call the dregs of the financial services industry as a stockbroker. They call them financial advisors today, and I think they're better today than they were before. But that was in the days of cold calling and pitching stocks and those types of things. That was what was passed off as financial advice. And I remember going to broker training in Hoboken, New Jersey, and they brought in these people for the Center of Excellence. And essentially what the Center of Excellence was a guy that taught you how to cold call, how to make more calls a day by basically being rude to people. So started there. After a couple of years, basically the 2000, the market decline there. In 2003, I moved to a firm called First Global, became a consultant to financial advisors. Now, First Global was a firm that served CPAs that wanted to become financial advisors or that wanted to incorporate financial services into their practice. And so that was an interesting experience in that they already had a business. And so they're very careful about how they approached financial services. And that was very well aligned with what kind of how I viewed the world. As part of that, when we were serving these financial advisors, I would find that I would recommend a certain portfolio. My colleague would recommend another one. Another colleague would recommend another one, and there would be different funds or different securities within those portfolios. And one day I went to my boss and I said, look, hey, we're making all these different recommendations. First of all, we should be maintaining our research on these investments so that if something changes, we can let the people know. I'm not saying that I can pick the best things. I just want to make sure that we have some collective view on which securities we want to offer. We couldn't do that. The firm was too big to try to keep track of who did what was implemented. And so that actually started my career in building out a discretionary asset management platform. So I became a due diligence analyst, an asset allocation policy person, built out quantitative processes there for security selection, and began managing discretionary multi-asset portfolios. That eventually led me to becoming the director of research there at First Global. And that's when I met Harry and started doing research, updating our asset allocation system, our asset allocation approaches, and also doing research with him on tax cognizant portfolio analysis, which was something that was really important for our advisors. And so we actually did a full set of research and actually created a prototype with the firm before I left there. I then had the opportunity to go work with Mark Kritzman at State Street Associates, which was also an amazing opportunity. Not only working with Harry, but Mark Kritzman, his background and that team, they're a really solid team. And I spent 3 years as an advisory research manager, working with institutional clients to advance research projects. That was an amazing opportunity, and learning from Kritzman and the team and being able to apply those things and working with clients was great. And then lastly, Invesco called me one day, and they had this head of thought leadership for solutions role. And I was like, yeah, thought leadership for solutions. And when we got to talking, it struck me that one of the things that would happen at State Street is that we would go present research, and at the end of those conversations, people would want to do something. And unfortunately, at least in that instance, there wasn't a way for them to work with us without paying large sum of money for a research engagement. And when I thought about what we could do at Invesco, I said, well, if we can develop research, go engage with clients. Once we get to the end of those conversations and they want to do something, I have a pathway to be able to share that with them. And so it was kind of I would say it was a risk for me to move over, because that was what I was going to try to do at First Global, at Invesco, and it worked out. So I've been here now, close to 7 years, building out this role, and it's been really an amazing journey.
Okay. Well, the next person I want to interview from your firm is the people who put together the commercials. I love the Invesco.
They do a great job. They really do. The cues.
They are funny. They're very entertaining. Well, I gave sort of a brief introduction of what your role is at Invesco, but I'm sure I didn't do it justice. You want to expand a little bit on it?
Yeah, like you said, yeah, absolutely. So like I said, I have a fairly unique role, and it's something that I've been building out as I've gotten here. And like you said, officially, I'm developing original research through different collaborations with our investment teams, industry researchers, and even institutional clients. But what I also do is try to actively look for opportunities to share research that our investment teams or Invesco is actually creating. That means that I'm out at conferences, that I'm out trying to find ways to share that research. So from a day-to-day perspective, basically I get to be involved in a lot of different interesting types of research with a lot of smart and interesting people. So it really is, in a lot of ways, a dream job. As with anything, there's the good side and the bad side. Doing research. Research is, from a business perspective, it's a costly thing. And so you always have to be balancing, all right, the type of research that you do and why you're doing it, how does it help the business? And so while I do get the opportunity to explore a lot of different areas of finance, the other part of it is that I'm also viewed closely to make sure that the things that I'm doing are relevant to the business. It doesn't have to be product specific, but there can be concepts that we can use to engage with clients and those types of things. It's not really, I don't view it necessarily as a huge constraint, but it does in some instances mean that I have to kind of pull off on some endeavors.
I can tell you do a
really
lot of
is
research.
fortunate.
Look at a stack of books on your desk. If we get that,
Oh, yeah.
read that. Well, you've obviously dealt with a wide range of topics. I would imagine all of those books vary. They're not all on asset allocation. So, which research efforts have you enjoyed the most?
So, I'll make the distinction between the research efforts I did with Harry, which I think will always be, for me, the most important and significant, because I learned I learned about doing a lot about doing research from Harry, and frankly, the opportunity to go through the asset allocation process from beginning to end with Harry Markowitz is just, I mean, who wouldn't want that experience? And talking to Harry, discussing how do you come up with assumptions, the covariance matrix, and those types of things. That was really just an amazing experience. The other part was the tax cognizant portfolio analysis, which was one of these things that really stretched me from a coding or an analytical perspective, because Harry was older at that time, and really what we would do is we'd talk about an idea, and he would essentially, after we discussed, he says, "Well, Ken, we need a model of covariance for this." I said, "Okay, all right, I'll go create that." And then we'd talk a little bit more, and he says, "Well, Ken, we need a taxation model to understand how taxes impact these our assets." Okay, so go and create a taxation model. And then we would say, well, we also need a multivariate simulator to understand taxes across a portfolio. And so I basically had to go off and do all of this by myself. And at that point, I didn't know MATLAB or Python or anything like that. I did everything in VBA and Excel, and it was a really interesting time. But that I'll always remember that experience as being something that was wonderful, because we took research from ideation to actually a prototype.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, he had to, he had to take the various series. I forget, I'm not familiar with the series 7 because or the series that you have to take. But when he was working as a consultant, he had to take all of those examinations. I don't know if you realize that he had to get
I didn't
licensed.
know this.
Yeah, he calls me up one day. He was upset, and he said, I just took the series and I forgot what it was." And he goes, and they asked me questions about my theory. I had no idea what they were talking about. Said, well, that's not unusual for it's like lawyers who take the CPA exam and they have a tough time on it, even though they know the law. But it was very funny on that. Well, by the way, how do you identify which research topics to pursue? Given that your research must support what client engagement uh, and your capabilities. I mean, how do you decide on which topics to cover?
So look, there are what I'll say there are three main avenues. One is going to be this is investment teams already have some type of an idea or a concept that they want to build out, and that's one of the avenues. The second one is the business needs some research for a particular in a particular area. And then the third is what I think are the funnest but most difficult are these kind of high level themes. And a lot of times that requires me doing a lot of selling within the firm to try to get those things pushed forward. These things can take several years. I've got 2 or 3 things right now that I've been working on or at least working on advancing for a couple of years. But to give you an example of some of these things, I think we did some work with ESG investing, right? And what I try to do with the research is to be pragmatic about it and provide insights, practical insights that would be useful to most investors and not one side or the other. And ESG was one of those. And we ended up with the framework. We worked with our ESG group, worked with Stephen Horan, great researcher, great guy. And we produced, and actually Elroy Dimson from Cambridge University on that. And we produced what I'll say a framework that allows you to look at and evaluate your ESG exposures. One of the arguments we made there, and I think the thing that made sense for us is that there was a lot of people doing ESG, and if you asked them how well did you do your ESG, nobody knew. And so what we suggested is that, look, if you're going to be doing this as an objective, whether you believe it in it or not, whether I believe it in or not, or whatever, if you're going to be doing this as an objective, you have to be able to monitor your progress towards achieving that goal in regular intervals, whether it's 1 year or 3 years or whatever. And so we proposed a framework for that. And it was funny because it's really useful for ESG. But when I was talking to some other folks, one of the things that they brought up was like, well, hold on, you can actually use this framework to actually weigh these carbon emission producers more heavily. So you can actually create an anti-ESG portfolio with the research that you've created. So yeah, you could do it both. This is just an objective approach to doing that. So it was a nice way of putting that together.
Let me take a wild guess. Your big project now is AI, something related to AI.
Actually, no. So although AI is a big deal, there are a lot of limits to that and to kind of where things are going with AI. I think right now the privacy aspects, I think people are still trying to understand how to use AI effectively. For now, I think what everybody agrees with is that AI can help to facilitate work. So you can from writing to even coding. You can ask, you can tell your AI system to produce some code, and you can start using that. That saves you hours on end. One of the key areas that we're actually doing, which I think is quite interesting, is for our model portfolios, each of which has different holdings and different securities and those types of things. We're using AI, or we're starting to use AI to produce market commentary that's specific for each one of those portfolios, and that has really limited, really cut down the time it takes to produce that quarterly commentary, which is great.
Yeah, I mean, just using NLP and being able to read every single document that the SEC puts out on a particular company is great. But what does the process look like when you're working with an investment team on research? Are you typically involved in the idea generation stage, or do you step in when the team has an initial concept?
It can be any one. I mean, it can range from any one of those things. So there are some instances where the team has an idea that they want to get out, and so we'll start off with kind of the ideation process. There may be research that they're already working on, but they don't have the capacity or the time to actually produce something. And I collaborate with them to produce those things. And then there's other things that come organically from just networking and keeping in contact with different teams, what they're doing and how they're approaching things. And that is in some instances leads to these high level themes that can be used by them. So, for example, um, one of the latest projects that I'm working on is the revisiting active management. Because that's the fundamental active management. Um, uh, that's obviously a big part of any asset manager. That's where there's revenues there. And so the point for what I'm trying to do is like, what can I say about fundamental active management? And so right now what we're going through is kind of revisiting all of the arguments against active management and trying to understand what has changed over over time. Is there something that
I don't want to interrupt, but I have a whole series of questions based on your very interesting work that you did for the CFA Research Foundation. So I do want to get into that. Okay. What challenges arise when translating investment team research into publishable articles? So I know you and your group have published in both the FAJ and JPM. Are there some common gaps between practitioner research and what journals expect?
Oh yeah, definitely. So definitely. And so when I think about investment teams or even asset managers, I think about four types of content that they produce. One is going to be market commentary. That generally is like the Fed did this and the markets did this. The other thing is the second one is asset class or product specific commentary. That's generally written by our investment teams. And then there's research or investment concepts. That's probably the smallest subset of things because that isn't necessarily kind of talking about money in motion, but that might be describing an investment approach, which could be useful for client engagements. And then there's some combination of those three. And I think about, for example, capital market assumptions. That kind of falls into both areas. There's research that produces them, and then there's the ongoing regular updates to those capital market assumptions. Now, what I'll say is for me is that the shelf life of these ideas needs to be long. So when you talk about market commentary or investment commentary, that's going to have a shelf life of maybe a quarter, maybe even a year. But what I'm trying to do is identify ideas or concepts that we can talk about today, we can talk about next year, or even 3 or 5 years from now about how our investment teams or how Invesco is thinking about approaching the world. And that makes it you have to kind of discern what ideas can I turn into these long shelf life concepts that can be used for engagement on an ongoing basis.
Well, your portfolio managers are all evaluated on performance. How do you measure the success of your research efforts? Is it based on client engagement, publication impact, internal adoption by your own investment teams? And can you share an example of research that led to meaningful client discussions?
Absolutely. So for me, for first and foremost, when I try to do research, I want to make sure it's research that I would be comfortable sharing. Right? It's not. I really have try to make a clear distinction between research, thought leadership, and marketing. So research is generally the raw idea that goes into a journal. Thought leadership might be some distillation of that into a more manageable, digestible form that can be shared. And then marketing is something completely different on trying to entice people. Mid caps are doing well, or you want to get into short duration or long, whatever it's going to be. So I make a real clear distinction about those types of things. Now, the second thing, so I got to be happy with it. Then secondarily, if I'm working with an investment team, they've got to be happy with it. If they're happy sharing this with their clients, essentially that's what I'm trying to do, then that to me is a good sign. The third is really measuring, has the research allowed us to have client conversations and engagements? And that's, I think, probably the most critical thing. Now, one point I will make here is all of the research that we do has to go through some avenue. So I've tried to find different avenues to get research, so savvy investing, those types of things. But generally, it has to go through our marketing and distribution folks. And so you have to translate that research in a lot of ways so that it's usable by them with their clients. And so there's a lot of time and effort that, not only producing the research, but producing additional content that goes along there. They tend to have a different view of the world. They want to have like KPIs. How many times did someone click on it? How long did they, those types of things. And that, at least from the raw research perspective, those are the numbers are going to be completely different, and the reach that you're going to get with those raw research pieces are going to be substantially different. And so that's always an ongoing conversation at the business, is how do we measure this kind of stuff? But generally, that's how I view the world.
Yeah, that's interesting. To me, going through firms that put up great, we have in the investments area, in the financial services industry, we have firms where there are researchers and that if you look at them, they top many of the top business schools finance programs in terms of their academic output. I mean, just incredibly good. My biggest problem in dealing with organizations is dealing with legal and compliance.
Yeah.
Someone submits an article and legal and compliance gives a some type of a notice that's like half the number of pages. And I can't tell you the number of superb articles that we accepted at Journal Portfolio Management, never published, because legal and compliance treats that as if it's like the next big merger that's going on between someone. I mean, we don't get simple things. And, and I realize it's very important because, having been with BlackRock, I know even the most minor suit against somebody cost $1 million to defend. But you know what? I want to go back to,
Can I make a point on that?
Go ahead.
Because I think that's another interesting constraint, because it also it requires me to define the type of research that we do. So, for example, some of the latest compliance rules are that if you include research on something that is related to a specific product, then when you present back-tested performance or anything like that, they're going to require you to include performance net of fees at the highest fees chargeable. So when I look at these things, that's why I think it's important to just look at concepts generally. I also try to avoid being product specific on the research, because it does, from a compliance perspective, really makes things complicated. So if I can just share the concepts, that from a compliance perspective makes things a lot easier. Now, what they've told me is that the SEC, or at least what they look at, what is set in conjunction. So if you sent the research piece plus a marketing piece, then it's all marketing. It's like, look, I can't control how it's distributed, but what I can do is I can produce a piece of work that can be distributed.
I think what evidence of most journals, I know I do this, the financial analyst does it, the Financial Analyst Journal does it. I know Gifford Fong does it. As soon as something even smells like marketing, we flush it right away. But it's
Right.
very interesting. You have people who write books on particular asset classes, and they're practitioners, and they write the whole book. You would wonder how they can get away with doing an entire book unless they already got permission from their legal and compliance. But I
Yeah.
do want to go back to I found very interesting your work. I think it was called Beyond Active and Passive Investing, and I think the subtitle was The Customization of Finance, where you did that for the CFA Research Foundation. That was one of the monographs you did for them, and you analyzed, I guess, the evolution of active and passive investing, and you predicted the future of asset management. Can you provide an overview of that work?
Yeah. So that I think is a great example of one of these long these thematic pieces that serves generally serves the firm, and it's not firm specific, but it serves the the firm in ways that it highlights what's happening in the industry, and it allows Invesco to share, this is how we're approaching these types of things. So it's not Invesco specific, it's industry specific, but it allows for client engagement to have those discussions. So yeah, so we did, it actually breaks down into two parts what we did there. The first was that, like you said, the evolution of active and passive investing over time from 1989 to 2021. And what I'll say there is that the perception of the investing landscape isn't necessarily reality. What we found was that, yes, passive investing has grown, but when you started looking, and this, we looked globally, we looked at ETFs and mutual funds all across the world. We broke them down into three different segments: the U.S., Europe, and then the rest of the world, which was kind of the catch-all. And what we found was that where you had the greatest growth in passive investing was first in equities. Secondly, primarily large cap blend. Large cap blend is a huge component of just total worldwide. U.S. large cap blend is a huge component of total worldwide AUM. We also found, what was interesting is that anytime you were using information to make investing decisions, so even you would say, well, okay, well, it's large cap, U.S. large cap is where passive exists. Well, it's not U.S. large cap, it's U.S. blend. Value and growth, those areas were mostly active and by a wide margin. And when we looked across the spectrum, large, mid, small, it was these core exposures where passive was actually gaining ground. And even in the global funds, we were starting to see movements away from regional into these global exposures, or that type of thing. So it's really, it points to how these assets are being used. They're being used for active investing, for asset allocation, those purposes, and there's these broad exposures. But the real interesting thing was that active management, at least today, AUM and active management continues to be greater worldwide than it is in passive, and the bulk of passive management is in U.S. large cap blend, which is something that neither Mark Ranganum, who was my co-author, neither he nor I expected that.
Yeah. Well,
the other thing is,
I'm sorry, you started with equity, then, it's much tougher to do in the fixed income area.
absolutely.
So I interrupted you. Were you going to talk about that?
Yeah, well, I could definitely add that one of the points that we saw there was smart beta. You could call that active light or whatever you want to call it. So smart beta actually had for a long time started making inroads into the enhanced indexing space, and then it's started flattening out, and I think it's starting to grow again. But fixed income has had a real difficult time with that. Although what we're seeing today is we're starting to see more and more fixed income factor portfolios, and I think that's going to be useful going forward for fixed income management and fixed income implications. So there, you are going to start seeing some inroads into the passive space. And historically, from at least from my experience, from an active perspective, you were always able to get a little bit more from active managers in the fixed income space than you were maybe. It was easier in the fixed income space than it might have been in the active equity space.
Do you remember who did the first equity index fund? Do you recall?
Well, the first one happened at Wells Fargo, but it wasn't widely available. I think that was can't remember who but the second one was Jack Bogle. So this was one of the things from that Vanguard, and that became kind of the broadly available thing. So let me get back to the monograph. So the
Sure. I'm sorry.
Perception of investing is not reality. The second thing is that we're moving towards customization. The asset management is moving from what I'll say asset management as a product, or portfolios as a product, to portfolios as a service, and that's going to be a big shift. And there's a lot of big things happening within the asset management industry. When it was really interesting to have the perspective of somebody like Mark Ranganum, who started his world in academics and then went. He managed actively managed portfolios, and then was head of beta. Equity beta at State Street. So we had a really broad view, and then I have the practitioner view, and so we were able to kind of see where things had been evolving, and we're really seeing what I'll say. The big part of this is what allowed us to get to where we are today is what we're calling pooling. This happened in the 1700s. Where we started getting these pooled assets, and that allowed people to gain access to securities or portfolios of diversified securities that they might otherwise not be able to gain access to because of minimum purchase amounts and those types of things. That started in the 1700s. Then we went to the open-end fund. We call that kind of the first closed-end types of vehicles. We get into open-end funds in 1924. That allowed for liquidity and being able to get in and out of these funds, which was something that wasn't the case with these closed-end funds. And then we get to ETFs here in the late 90s that facilitated a lot of this stuff. And along the way, there's been a lot of infrastructure, a lot of expertise and know-how into being able to develop and manage those products very cheaply. These passive products, I will say, they are passive exposures, but it takes a lot of active management to get those passive exposures in place and track an index without trying to mitigate the costs of trading. And now we're going into these active ETFs. But what's going to be happening as we customize is there's going to be a depooling of assets. So all that scale that we started getting and that allowed us to get to where we are today, people are now demanding customized solutions. So whether their preferences for ESG or their even tax consequences or even investment horizons, right? You can start producing these solutions that are tied to somebody's specific liabilities, their specific investment horizons, their preferences, their tax circumstances, and those types of things. But to do those types of things, you're going to need to be able to depool these assets. So think about taxes. If you want to effectively try to extract or get or accumulate capital losses so that you offset gains in the future, you can't do that with an ETF, even though the ETF is very tax efficient. But if you want to generate those losses, then that is going to be it's much more effective to do that with individual securities. So that means having them in an account. What I will say is, when we first started talking about this, we had some of the folks within the firms like, "What are you going to say, that ETFs are going away, or and that these funds are going away?" I'm not saying that. There's always going to be a case where it might be easier. You might be looking for that exposure, but there are going to be cases where you want to be able to pull out of that exposure, especially, for example, in the tax circumstances or even in the ESG preferences circumstances.
Well, we've always talked about really taking into consideration taxes and collective and pooled investments, but that's all people did was really talk about them. Some firms I know, some asset managers have people who are dedicated to that and running money. By the way, do you know how boring it was when they first started on indexing? When I was considering leaving teaching and going into industry, and so I got called in by Bankers Trust, which had an index one. It was the most boring job you could imagine. Don't forget, very little in terms of, you have more computer power in your cell phone than we had at that time in managing money. And you would actually have to sit there at the end of the day. They would give you a printout of what was in the portfolio, what you had to change. Then you had to make up a list, give it to a runner who went down to someone to execute the order and all that. I started teaching. That was doing it, but it was really and the funny thing was, many people consider historically that indexing was the first quantitative asset management. But so let me just, what are the key implications or your perspective on what all of this means for the future of traditional active management strategies?
Well, let me first touch on the implications for the investment management industry, because I think they're going to be pretty big. I mean, when we're talking about evolving from providing asset management as products to asset management as services, there's a lot of first of all, you have to get much closer with your clients or the advisors. And so for Invesco, our key clients are financial advisors or even institutions. So you have to build out teams and people that are able to collaborate and understand the needs of these different groups. So one of the things that I'm arguing is that collaboration across the value chain, from client to financial advisor to asset manager, that's gonna increase. But that also means having capabilities to educate, having capabilities to be able to be diplomatic about things that can be done and things that can't be done. And what I'll say there, and I think every time I say it, people kind of chuckle, is that the value of an extroverted quant is going to go up, tremendously. So people that understand quantitative finance or understand finance, but are also able to have meaningful conversations and develop relationships with people, those are to me, those are going to be the people that are going to be in high demand. Otherwise you're going to be commoditized, put in a corner doing some quant work. But if you're able to talk to clients, make concepts easy to understand, be diplomatic about, like I said, things that can and cannot be done, or should not be done, that's going to be really important. Second thing is the technology, right? So the pooling allowed for scale. So you could do this one fund, and the costs of managing that fund for every dollar added is very tiny, if marginal. But once you start doing these individual accounts, the cost and infrastructure to produce the technology, to produce the reporting, to produce the relationships, that's going to be something that I think the industry is now dealing with, right? So, and it's happening at a time where there's a lot of pressure on costs. But this is going to be the key challenge for asset managers: is how do we get to this point in the future, be able to provide these solutions, have the dollar amounts that are required to be able to offer these solutions profitably, have those come down to a point where you're serving a broader range of clients. That's a key thing. And again, that's infrastructure costs, technology costs, and then human capital costs. So that's going to be a key area. And then lastly is what we'll say is the distinction between active and passive investing is going to become increasingly less relevant, right? So once you start customizing, what we say is that customization is active management, even if you're using passive products. And the thing that I like to often talk about is, think about a tax efficient S&P mandate. Yeah, so you're tracking an S&P index, but you're trying to do it in a way where you're offsetting the tax implications of that. That's highly active. Like I said, you're generating losses so that you can offset the future gains, and then still trying to track the S&P. Looks passive, but it is highly active. Even our model portfolio businesses today, and that's what I said when we look at the evolution of things. We have passive products, but they're being used in very active ways to produce portfolios. A portfolio, in essence, is an active choice. How do I allocate across different asset classes or different assets to get the outcomes that I want? That's I think Harry Markowitz brought that to us, allowed us to pick have risk preferences and align to risk preferences. That's already active management, even though we're doing it with passive products, and that's only going to expand as we start catering to different needs and preferences and those types of things. The future is active, even though passive is going to be a big part of that.
Tell me what else you learned from the master.
Wow. I do want to go back to one point on the mutual funds, because you did ask that, but let me.
Sure.
That's a really good question, Frank. I mean, I think having had the opportunity to spend time with Harry, it's the three things that I'll point out there is, Harry was big on judgment and approximation, and I'll always remember, one of his pet peeves was when people would come up to him with correlation that had 10, 2 point or 30.1239788. That was like, and what he would tell me is like, if you think about it, you're doing an asset allocation for 10 years. And if you're going to come tell me that you can ascertain the correlation of something with that level of precision, then clearly you don't understand the problem that you're facing, right? So the life is uncertain. These are all estimates. These are all approximations to what is, a model of the world. And so uncertainty and precision just don't go together. And so you have to be comfortable with this uncertainty or this approximation, and use judgment in dealing with these things. The second thing was the importance of developing intuition, and this was something that I learned as part of our research efforts. It's like, first you have to understand, what do I believe about something? What are my priors about this thing? And part of the reason you do that, and you spend time thinking about that, is that it allows you to understand what questions you have about the topic at hand. All right, so I believe this, this, and this. You start getting questions about, all right, well, what about this? Or what about that? Or why not this? Or why not that? That is part of the work that I always joke with when I talk to students. I always joke with them is that sometimes you just need to sit down at your desk and think, or just sit down and think, or do whatever and think. It doesn't look like you're working, but in fact, you're probably doing your most important work just sitting there thinking. And one of the things that Harry would do daily is take a walk. And he did it first for health reasons, but secondly because that's where he was able to think most clearly. Lastly, I'll say Harry was a great guy, and so be kind and have fun exploring ideas. Don't be dogmatic about ideas. Explore those ideas with people. A lot of times you can gain, have humility about what you understand, and understand that there are people that understand certain areas of the world much more than you do, and much more than you probably ever will. And so have fun exploring those other things and look across domains. Harry devoted 1 day a week reading something that had nothing to do with finance. And for him, that was really useful, because it allowed him to generate different ideas. It's funny. There's a lot of things that Harry would do. There's this book that I recently read by a gentleman by the name of Richard Hamming. He was a famous mathematician. It's called The Art of Doing Science and Engineering, Learning to Learn. And one of the things that he points out is that all knowledge is connected. There's some universality to these things. Even though we're taught subjects in very finite categories, all of it is connected somehow. And the sooner you understand that there are solutions to problems that you have that exist outside of these categories that have been, created arbitrarily, the better it is for you. I highly recommend that book, because, like I said, it does a lot of the things, even some of the stuff that I shared about just thinking about things, having these ideas is, it's all in that. But those are the things that I think that most important things that I took away from working with Harry, that I try to pass on to everybody.
Well, since I think you're going to write his biography someday, when you have leisure time, one of the things, I'll give you two quick stories. One story is, I spoke to his granddaughter who majored. I don't know if you know his granddaughter. She went to MIT. She was an economics major, and I said to her, why did you decide to become an economics major? And she goes, well, my grandfather won the Nobel Prize in economics. I figured, how hard could it be? she was hilarious. And then it was very funny. His assistant, Midge?
Oh,
Right?
Midge is fantastic. Both
Right.
Midge
He was
and
great.
Lily. I don't know if you've ever worked with Lily,
No, I
but
didn't
both
work with
Midge and
Lily,
Lily
no.
are fantastic.
But Harry, and Midge all share the same birthday, not the same year.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Same birthday, yeah. So one day, on my birthday, he calls me up. Both of them call me up. I wasn't there, and they recorded a song. They sang "Happy Birthday." I then tried to get that off. I then changed my phone. I tried to get that. I figured it would be an interesting historical
Harry was.
recording. I couldn't
Both
get
of
it.
them were so much fun,
Yeah.
and that was one of the things I remember about Harry is that we had contracted with Harry, and I can tell you the story about how we brought him on board, which is pretty funny. but we contracted with Harry for 2 1-hour calls a week. And so I would have, theoretically, I was supposed to have 2 1-hour calls a week with Harry. I never had a 1-hour call with Harry. Every call I had with him was somewhere between 2 and 4 hours. A good part of it was spent joking, Harry singing show tunes, those types of things. I mean, it was just a lot of fun. And a lot of times he's, just spent teaching me things that are like how to think about this or what about that. And so he would elaborate on different concepts and how we got to those concepts and those types of things. It was just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I share all your experiences. I've done a few books with him, and I've done articles with him, more of educational type articles, and he was just wonderful to work with, thorough, never accepting anything except thinking through everything. He wrote a lot of articles in the latter part, which was very critical of what was going on in the industry. But let me hit my last question here. This year, what is it? The 80th anniversary of the Financial Analyst Journal. Okay, very important forum for the industry, and I think it's the 60th anniversary of the CFA Institute Research Foundation. Okay, what are your thoughts on the role of the FAJ within the industry? You've published research there through the CFA Research Foundations on. I think you've done several papers. Why did you choose to pursue publication through the Research Foundation? A lot of people ask me, why publish through them?
Yeah. So there's a lot there in that question. So let me first touch on kind of the FAJ and I think the role in the industry. Obviously, there's clearly it's been around a while, but for anyone wanting to understand where ideas came from, it's probably the single most important repository of information about how we got to the ideas that we got to today, that exists and is widely available to investment practitioners. I think if you have a CFA charter, you are able to access the FAJ, and this is just widely available to everybody. So even in for example, our active and passive investing, our beyond active and passive investing, when we went back and looked at articles, what we found was that there were, where did the debate actually begin? And it began in 1960 with 2 papers in the Financial Analyst Journal. One was a guy, Renshaw and Feldstein, who made the case for an unmanaged investment company. And then the one later that year was by a guy named John Armstrong, who made the case for active management. Interestingly, Armstrong was the pen name of Jack Bogle, who would then do the. But those were 2 papers where you start seeing the discussion. This is 1960, and we were only able to get that and those ideas or the genesis of these ideas through something like the FAJ. Other things don't exist like that in the industry in terms of a repository, a centralized repository, where we've had some of the biggest minds in finance actually publish papers and have arguments. I remember for example, the famous argument between Kritzman and Brinson on the importance of asset allocation. That was you could see the back and forth. Where else can you get that type of thing? As for the Research Foundation,
Well, I'm gonna interrupt you there because if I don't, I think the publishers of the Journal Portfolio Management are going to be upset that I didn't say anything. The JPM started, I think, about 20 years later. No, about 14 years later. So I do agree with you that the FAJ was very, very important, but there are other forms that have developed.
No, Frank, yeah, I completely agree with that. I think the key distinction, and look, was it Peter Bernstein and everything that starting it there. It's hard to beat out somebody like Peter, and the JPM also has it's an amazing repository of ideas. I guess the one criticism that I would have is that the accessibility of the JPM isn't as great as the FAJ. So I think both are critical. And I think if you're going to be doing financial research, you need to have access to JPM, a lot of the PMR journals, but the Financial Analyst Journal is I think, also central to getting a complete picture of the ideas in our industry.
One of the things that And it's not just those two. I mean, there's several other journals that have developed in specialized area. But the thing that has gotten me, and I'm holding back trying to publish to submit this article, is if you talk to some universities about the types of people that they are hiring in finance, they only want people who can publish in the top 3 journals in finance. I mean, you may not have had a lot of experience with Journal of Finance, the Journal of Financial Economics, and a Review of Financial Studies. Those are considered the top 3. Some universities would not hire someone or grant them a promotion or tenure without publishing those journals. And yet, if you look historically, they've come up with brilliant ideas. I mean, Harry Markowitz's paper, obviously, in the Journal of Finance. And but the fact is, if you look at who took everything from an idea to the final application of it, that was really in practitioner journals. You look at Harry's ideas. He and I wrote something a long time ago about who's using mean variance analysis. And what you see is, if it wasn't for these practitioners, and not just the 2 journals we've mentioned, but also other journals, if you look at that, you will see that getting people to use it required the ability to implement, okay? And that really has come out of these practitioner journals, much like, Thomas Edison was a great promoter and entrepreneur, but he wasn't necessarily the person who developed all the theories, which appeared in all the the scientific journals. I didn't mean to cut you off.
But there is a clear distinction, and I think if you were, for example, the Journal of Finance and some of the stuff there, if you were to read articles there versus the articles that you get in JPM or even FAJ, you get a practical understanding of where you can use that or the ideas that are being presented. Journal of Finance or some of these other journals, those are strictly academic exercises, right? And with little attention paid to the practical implications of implementing or those types of things. I hate to generalize, but that's part of what I would say.
Yeah. Well, let me.
Well, there's
did you want to
the
make
research.
more comments? Right. Go ahead.
Yeah.
I keep taking us off course. I'm sorry about that.
No worries. But the Research Foundation, I do want to make a point there. So the
Sure.
Research Foundation and the active management part, because I think I'm really excited about that part of the research. But the Research Foundation and publishing in the Research Foundation, that has a pretty unique role in the industry. There's nowhere else in the industry that you can publish complete sets of ideas. And so generally, when you write an article, you're going to be limited in the number of pages, although that's changed recently because none of these that are in print. But the Research Foundation allows you, our active and passive investing. That's 100+ page piece, and it allows you to completely address some type of thing there. And I look at some of the books, and this has been, even when I started in the industry, I used to love getting those CFA monographs because those provided oftentimes some aggregated views of some of the most important thinkers. I always think about like the monograph after the financial crisis, and I even have financial market history. These are really useful and really interesting pieces that you otherwise would not be able to get. Like I said, it's a very special role in the industry, and I hope it continues in its current form. But I think it's really, really important.
Yeah. I mean, you're preaching to the choir here because, first of all, I'm on the board, the CFA, and I agree with you. And by the way, all of those monographs are now free. You used to have to pay for them. Okay, everything now seems to be free that they give away. They've done a great job. In fact, this morning, we've agreed to do one of these conversations with Frank Fabozzi, dedicated to the CFA Institute Research Foundation. I was preparing,
Oh, wow.
preparing all my questions, and that's going to be recorded on March 13th, and then I don't know when it will go out, but they've done a fabulous job. I mean, I'm a sort of a newbie on it. I think I've only been on it for a year, but you can't believe how incredibly hard they work. And not only that, their whole relationship with universities. I mean, universities that don't use those monographs that you show to teach on making, it's an injustice for their students. And they keep putting out more and more. They have to, what is it called? Enterprising investors.
Yeah, enterprising
They have
investor.
these great things. You were going to show something?
Yeah, so I mean, but even like so, even like this is what is it? The Founders of Modern Finance, their prize-winning concepts. This is an old monograph. I lost this one and I just purchased it. But this is
Hold it,
a
you
great
purchased
place
it?
to
I
be.
thought it was free.
I bought it on Amazon. I did pay for it because I guess you can get, I think you can get it online free, but I guess if you want it printed,
Oh
there's a
yeah,
cost
I'm
of
kidding.
printing.
Okay, yeah.
That uh, uh, I mean, that's the, like, it's the financial market history, and I was going to go somewhere else with that. So, I was going to mention even, for example, Bud Haslett's piece on the investment luminaries, and that is like, what a wonderful piece to be able to distill like the people that created finance for us, or that created the modern financial world, and get their ideas and get their like what they learned, and where else are you going to get those types of things? And that's
Yeah,
missing.
absolutely right. Like I said before, the the thing is that I don't know if there's enough academics who teach finance to use that. I don't think there's an area, a topic within finance that they don't have a major product on.
Yeah,
I mean,
and all these
they're
are
just
high caliber
wonderful,
people.
talented people, people who, who have been major contributors, Joe and Hill, Winkleman. I mean, you can name them all. We could sit here and just do
Yeah.
an entire
A lot of
discussion.
Moberg's latest piece on
That's
active and passive.
right. That's why I decided I wanted to have one just dedicated to the CFA Institute
That's a
Research
great idea,
Foundation.
Frank.
And I'm looking forward to that because I mean, it's the first place I go to when I'm looking for something on a topic. But I do want to thank you not only for this presentation, but for all your help in the general portfolio management. I mean, we take great pride in having people who guide us, like yourself, and practitioners. I mean, and anytime I need help on something and identifying people, you're on my speed dial. Although that's an awkward term nowadays, the speed dial with our cell phones. But I do appreciate all the help you've given me. I really enjoyed this presentation. I mean, this interview. So I appreciate that. But before we conclude, we got tied up in such what I thought was very interesting discussions about the CFA Institute Research Foundation. I forgot to come back to one of the most interesting questions. Why don't you tell us what you're doing right now in the area of asset allocation? I think you're working with John Gerard, or is it?
John, well,
And
yeah.
also
So
Larry Siegel, right?
Larry Siegel and John Gerard. Yeah, and
Yes.
we're looking at active management. Actually, that gets back to this notion of what are the implications for active managers in the future. And I think when we look at things, I mean, obviously, and this has always been the case, that benchmark hugging active managers are not long for this world. But what I do think is important is that active strategies, and we're talking right now focusing on fundamental active equity strategies, need to offer something distinct to investors, have a clearer value proposition. And as we're starting to go through this research, one of the things that I'm starting to understand is that there's propositions or value propositions or characteristics that active managers can bring to the table that are beyond just excess return. So the characteristics of the portfolios, the exposures that the portfolios provide, and those types of things. And when we think about active strategies, those are going to start being customized too. Invesco is already doing these types of things. We're customizing active strategies for specific clients for specific preferences. That's all coming down the pike. But when we think about active management generally, one of the things that came to me the other day is actually this was in December. It was the 50th anniversary of von Hayek's what was it? The Pretense of Knowledge Nobel lecture. It just reminded me about the importance of how you think about the world. And he makes the distinction in that lecture about the difference between quantifiable and non-quantifiable information. And there's another paper called The Use of Knowledge in Society, where he presents what's called the knowledge problem, is that there's knowledge that's quantifiable and easy accessible, and then there's other information and other knowledge that is dispersed across the economy and dispersed across people that will never be able to be quantified and will never have the opportunity to get to some central authority to make these whole decisions. So that's one part of it. That led me to Frank Knight and the risk, uncertainty, and profit. And he makes the distinction between risk, which is quantities that are susceptible to measurement, as well as uncertainty. These are the things that are not susceptible to measurement. And here he describes kind of the entrepreneur and the ability to generate profit is generally occurring in these areas of uncertainty, not in the measurable risk, which can often be hedged away. And so when I started thinking about active management per se, you can't do that without thinking about Fama 1970, the efficient markets hypothesis. And where I'm getting to where we're getting to that is that active management lives somewhere between von Hayek and Knight, and then Fama 1970, and then Fama French 1992, because it's that you get to these two concepts, efficient markets, and then, oh, by the way, there's anomalies that the markets don't necessarily explain. Active management lives between those spaces. And so when you think about managing a portfolio or implementing a portfolio, these are different information sources that you can get access to. So the indexes are going to provide you the average market information. Quant strategies are going to give you the quantifiable stuff. And the only place to get this uncertainty and those types of things is going to be in these fundamental active approaches. Now, all of this requires that you get a good active manager. That never goes away. And that's one of the things that when I've talked to our active management teams, I said, there's nothing I can write that will make somebody want to, buy an underperforming strategy. But when we think about active management, here's kind of a framework to start thinking about it. We're building on that, but I'm pretty excited about it because it's a different way of thinking about the world.
Yeah, aren't you slated to contribute to the special issue we're having on the future of asset management?
We
discussed it, didn't we?
Yeah, we discussed it. I haven't.
Now you stop. Now you have to do it. If you don't do it, I'm going to refer to in my editor's letter that you didn't come through. So you're stuck now. Okay. Thanks a lot.